Sure. This came about for me about 30 years ago when I started eating a vegetarian diet for ethical reasons, not realizing the health benefits that came along with that. But I wasn't doing it correctly at first. I started off with a very unhealthy vegetarian diet, and then I graduated to an unhealthy vegan diet in a way. And then I ran into Dr. Pam Popper. I stumbled upon one of her classes back in the late 90s, and that was a life changer for me. I began to realize the importance of food and where I was going wrong with it. And I switched my diet and saw such great results that I decided to become certified for Dr. Popper at that time. That was many years ago. And since then, I decided to pursue a career path with that just to help people. There's so many people suffering needlessly. And I just had a heart to write a book about it and to just offer classes in my area and to help people as much as I could.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world. Dr. Sal Lekanina. I do have a last name. I'm the medical director for Lifestyle Medicine Institute and the CHIP program. I want to welcome anybody that's new to the program today and welcome back people that have been here in the past. I want to say Happy New Year again. We're still in January, so Happy New Year to everyone. And hopefully this will be the start of a great year. I want to just send a prayer to our new president and vice president. I think that's apropos at the start of a new year and a new era for us. So blessings to them, and hopefully we'll have a good 2021. As we did last week, we had a great show last week with Dr. Clapper. Mike is such an enjoyable person to talk to. We have another great person to talk to today, Cyd Notter, who you just saw on the video, who's going to talk to us about her Plan A diet and really combining whole foods and plant-based nutrition with our lifestyle, which is just so important. And at the start of a year, the new year, everybody has these New Year resolutions. So this is really a good time to talk about the Plan A diet. So let me just read you a brief introduction. Cyd is a graduate of the Center for Nutrition Studies. She's a certified instructor of the Starch Solution and other dietary courses. She's a past newspaper columnist and the founder of the Plan A Diet. She offers a variety of health and cooking classes, provides nutrition coaching on both individual and corporate levels, speaks to local groups. She's worked with the school district employees and with hospital fitness centers. Again, she's the founder of the Plan A Diet. Cyd and her husband live in Illinois, and she enjoys outdoor activities, classic movies, and old Volkswagens. I didn't know that about her. So, and also before she gets on, just remember that there is a chat box. So if you have questions or comments, please put them into the chat box. Again, all shows are archived, so you can go back and see any of them again. And without further ado, I will ask Cyd to join me on the screen. Hello, Cyd.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you today?
Excellent. Very good. Very good. Thanks for being on the program. Hopefully you're having a good start to the new year.
I am having a good start. I'm in Cape Coral. We're snowbirds. So
yes, that's right. Originally from Illinois, right?
Yes.
Right, exactly. So I know you're going to give a little bit of a presentation, and you have some slides, so we can show the slides and then maybe discuss some of them as we go along, but certainly I'll keep an eye on the chat box for questions. So I'll turn the screen over to you.
Okay, well, thanks, Dr. Sell. This is going to be a presentation called The 12 Barriers to Change. And in my 25 years of coaching people, these are some of the things that I've noticed can keep people stuck. Even when they want to make changes, they still struggle to do so. Okay, the 12 barriers to change. And let me get to the next screen here. We know that change is an unavoidable part of life, right? But just thinking of that sometimes can trigger anxiety in us. So when I wrote my book, I called a chapter there, The 12 Barriers to Change. And this is kind of a recap of that chapter. And this presentation only represents a drop in the bucket. You know, I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist in any way. But if you see yourself struggling in one of these areas, maybe, you know, it's something you'd want to dive into deeper on your end. So the first two barriers deal with ignorance. One is blind ignorance and one is willful ignorance. And blind ignorance is when someone truly has never been exposed to the message of how diet affects their health. And of course, all of you who are watching Dr. Cell's webinars would definitely not fall into that category. Nobody here is in a state of blind ignorance. Willful ignorance, though, on the other hand, is when someone is aware that their food choices matter, but they just don't care about it. They're apathetic, or they have an attitude of indifference about it, and they'd rather not know the health consequences of the poor choices that they're making. So apathy is said to be the precursor for depression. So that's why it's important to be aware of it and address it. A few of the underlying reasons for apathy could be boredom or stress or isolation or low self-worth. So to combat apathy, it's important to recognize what's causing it and then take steps to regain your motivation, because motivation combats apathy. And one way to become motivated is to pick one hobby or interest that has the most potential to engage you, and then set a few goals around that interest. Maybe you'd like to learn a new language or a skill, or how to play an instrument, or simply get the garage cleaned out. And then break that interest down into small action steps and commit to moving forward every single day for at least 6 to 8 weeks. Then carry that newfound motivation over into setting goals for your health and weight issues. The next common barrier that I've seen is the fear of change. So fear disturbs our perceptions and can really keep us stuck when we're asked to do something unfamiliar or step out of our comfort zone, or when we're asked to consider new ways of shopping and cooking, or when we have when we have to face new changes to our routines and diet. That can be fearful. We might even fear another failure if we've been unsuccessful in the past with making diet changes. So don't let a spirit of fear overtake you when you're making changes. Instead, take time for some deep reflection to figure out what your fears are and write them down, and then evaluate your fears to see if they're actually legitimate. Ask yourself that if those fears were to come to fruition, would they actually pose a danger to you or to someone else? The fourth barrier is the avoidance of pain, and this one is very common. This doesn't relate to physical pain per se, but anything that appears too much of a hassle to deal with. So if someone is unwilling to endure short-term trials, which are necessary to achieve results, they'll unfortunately never see the long-term gain or benefits. For example, when you improve your diet, your taste buds are going to recalibrate, your bowel habits are probably going to change. You might even have a few detoxing symptoms as those bad foods work their way out of your system. There's going to be a time commitment and a new learning curve to learn how to shop and cook differently. But people who view all of those things as negatives to be shunned are pain avoiders who unfortunately will never see the long-term payoff. So remember this, that anything of value has this rhythm: pain first and payoff later. And that's a quote from a book by Dr. Henry Cloud that I highly recommend. It's called Never Go Back, 10 Things I'll Never Do Again. And he devotes an entire chapter to the topic of choosing short-term comfort over long-term benefit. The next barrier is habits. And most of us are creatures of habit. I know I certainly am, with my grocery store purchases or recipes I choose or exercise routines and so on. But habits can become an issue when the dependency on unhealthy eating patterns prevents us from making changes. And when those habits become too deeply ingrained, then it may be time to re-examine the importance that you're placing on them. So habits in and of themselves can be good, though. There's nothing wrong with being a creature of habit when those habits promote good health. So the trick here is to redirect your energy toward the positive habits and use them to replace the negative ones. Write down what your new habits will look like. For example, for breakfast, you'll have oatmeal and fruit instead of Pop-Tarts from now on, or you'll bring healthy muffins in the car instead of stopping at the donut shop. Or for a sweet treat at night, you'll make healthy homemade raspberry sorbet rather than have Ben and Jerry's. So when we perform the same actions day after day, those habits develop and they soon become second nature. Okay, the sixth barrier is false perception. And this comes into play when people believe that eating healthy is too hard or too expensive or too time consuming, or they believe that the foods are boring or tasteless or that they lack nutrition. False perception also leads many people to believe that they're healthier than they really are. And it's our predispositions and assumptions that play a big role in how we perceive reality. So a few ways to overcome false perception is to be open-minded regarding the credible, independent research that's out there, and be willing to experiment with new recipes and find a community of healthy plant-based eaters, either locally or online, and hang out there so you can learn some of the successes that other people are having.
Yeah, that brings up, I don't mean to interrupt you, but that brings up the whole issue of looking at the science and false perceptions. And I'm sure you hear this also when you talk to people about eating more plant-based proteins. Oh, I'm not going to get enough protein in my diet if I don't eat meat, and the expense issue. So this slide really brings up a lot of things that we talk about in the exam room every day. Healthy eating is not more expensive. You don't need animal protein to be strong. And if you really watch and look at the science and the research, it's very clear that plant-based eating is extremely important for our health.
Yes, and I always stress that it has to be independent research, right? That isn't funded by somebody who's going to profit from the results.
Amen, right.
Okay, so the next barrier number 7, is denial, which is the refusal to acknowledge that we have a food problem or how those food choices are impacting our health. It's pretending that a problem doesn't exist. And I'm not sure how you'd even recognize this as one of your barriers if you're truly in a state of denial. But you would not be alone, because Gallup polls show that Americans are less likely each year to see themselves as overweight, and they're even less likely to want to lose weight each year.
Yeah, I think that actually this slide really also relates to the first one on willful ignorance. And I've talked to a number of my patients and even family and friends over the years to watch videos on agribusiness and really look at the reality of how processed foods come about and how animal protein is really a processed food. And people will be willfully ignorant. They say straight out, oh, I don't want to watch that. I don't really want to know. So it's the whole concept of willful ignorance and denying that there's a problem that really is a significant barrier to moving on to being healthier.
Yeah, those two barriers are really intertwined and linked.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, that's good.
So refusing to acknowledge our weight and health issues could be a coping mechanism for some people. Maybe thinking about their problems causes them anxiety or stress, or maybe it's difficult for them to admit aspects about themselves that they really don't want to, have exposed. So if you're stuck in denial, though, or you suspect you might be, you might need to seek help to acknowledge your problems and find ways to face the issues that you're denying.
Right.
Yeah. So another one is the 8th barrier is pride or rebellion. And there's a difference between healthy pride and unhealthy pride, which is kind of like ego, right? Our unhealthy pride is when we have ego. And unhealthy pride is when a person believes that they're superior to other people or that they'll never get sick. I've had clients like this, actually, that they don't think they could ever possibly become ill. It's difficult for them to admit that they're making unhealthy choices as well. Plus, they feel like no one is ever going to tell them what to eat, so they become defensive about it. Any constructive feedback about their food choices is either dismissed or viewed as a threat often.
Yeah.
And I've even noticed...
I think having this conversation with people really brings up the emotional aspects of eating and how we're tied to a culture or a certain way of eating or living. And it brings up the defensiveness right away, as you're alluding to, which we really have to be cognizant about as healthcare providers, making sure that we're not putting somebody on the defensive when we start to talk to them about healthier ways of living. Because you have to if you don't get past that barrier, you'll never teach an individual anything, and they really won't start to really see that what you're trying to teach them is going to be helpful for them.
Right. So what do you do then, Dr. Sal? Do you just stop when you realize that you're not going to be able to change their minds in any way? Do you just
Yeah, I'll be very upfront with them, and really even to say, I don't want to threaten your culture or your way of living and such. I just want to really look at the science. I always try to get back to the science of nutrition. I think Dr. Greger does a phenomenal job of that, really always bringing us back to the science of nutrition and how important it is to pay attention to that, so that the individual understands that we're on the same team here. I'm not just here to just tell you what to do. I'm here to work with you so that we can overcome all these barriers. I think you really just have to be upfront about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, the antidote for pride or ego is to set aside self-focus and develop a posture of humility. Humility allows us to listen graciously to other people, right? And it allows us to be flexible in our thought patterns. And these are tall orders, which require some deep soul searching, and determination, and a sincere change of heart. This is something, that does require you to change your heart in a way. And humility also allows us to have an accurate opinion of ourselves, and it restrains us from having to be the center of our own world, right? That's really what pride is.
Right.
All right. The next barrier, and this is a big one that I see, is family and social pressure.
Yep.
And this can have a major influence on food choices. Many people tell me that their family members are the reasons that a healthy diet won't work in their house, because the other people would never go for it. So when family members or friends are indulging in unhealthy food, sometimes it can seem easier to just join in and eat that bucket of chicken rather than stick to your healthy diet. Maybe you want to avoid the scrutiny, especially if people are making you feel guilty, about what you're doing.
Right. Isn't it interesting? People will make you feel guilty about taking care of yourself and eating healthy, as opposed to realizing that, that's not the issue at all. And one of the things that I've talked to family, friends, and patients about is really not identifying yourself, if you will. It was always interesting to go out with people to a restaurant, and right away the individual would say to the waiter or the waitress, "Well, I'm vegan. This is the way that I have to eat." And I would always say, there's probably that's not really beneficial to point that out and to label yourself. It's just making people understand that this is the way that I want to eat. This is the way I feel, it's healthy for me personally. And really not giving into the social pressure is very important. I mean, if you do it once a month, it's probably not going to kill you. But if you're doing this on a regular basis, it could really impact your health. So it's a great barrier to talk about.
Yeah, it's a common one, too. It's very common. So the first line of defense would be to have a frank discussion with your family members, right? And assure them that they're not under attack and they're not going to be forced to eat as you do. Explain what's motivating you to eat better, and then ask for their support and share exactly how they can help you, right? You're going to have to negotiate some things. Who's going to do the shopping and cooking? Are they willing to store their unhealthy foods somewhere else, out of your sight, so you're not tempted by them? Are they willing to join in with you once in a while and eat something that you're preparing? So whatever your negotiations are, and this varies from family to family. I've seen a lot of families that are divided when it comes to food, and they have figured out how to make it work. But remember that you do not need your family's support to change your diet. Yes, things would be a lot easier if you had it. There's no doubt. But again, it can be worked out. I've seen this happen time and time again. And if you're interested, I have a short presentation about this very topic on my YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and type in Cyd Notter, and you'll see it there. It's like an 8-minute presentation just on family and social pressure, because it is that important.
Okay.
Okay, so next is, and this is another biggie, emotional eating, right? This can be a big barrier to change. And this happens when we deal with the stressors of life by turning to food.
Right.
Emotional eaters use food to soothe anxiety, stress, sadness, boredom, or to delay dealing with problems. And as an emotional eater myself, I can certainly attest to that, because when I'm faced with something I don't want to do, I can find my head in the refrigerator quite often.
Right, exactly. And this year has been a year that has challenged our ability not to emotionally eat.
Right.
That's why I think it's really a good time to see this transition for many reasons. Hope to God we're getting over the pandemic and more people are getting their vaccines, and things hopefully are changing in the nation in and of itself. So, getting out of that emotional eating, which I know a lot of people have dealt with in the past year, is something really to be careful about, because this could turn into a really big health problem.
Right. I mean, don't they call it the COVID-15 or something, like
Yeah,
15
yes,
pounds that people are
right.
putting on?
The quarantine 15, I think it is called.
Okay.
I've
Oh,
heard that. Yeah, everybody's gaining 15 pounds being quarantined. And well, now there's no excuse. We're going to get out and start having an active year. So no
yay.
excuse anymore.
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to emotional eating, here's a few of the tips from my book. So you have to develop a plan of attack by, first of all, knowing your weak spots, right? What's
Mhm.
going to send you to the kitchen or the drive-up window? And then develop some alternative coping methods that don't involve food. So if you eat out of boredom, for example, devise a plan where you're going to organize a closet or take up a hobby or go for a walk or read a book or just have a cup of tea, right?
Yeah.
You have to have some things in place.
Hmm.
If you eat when you're lonely, visit a friend or Zoom, do a Zoom call with someone. Just, get that social interaction.
Hmm.
If you eat when you're anxious, then give yourself permission to stop right there and sit down for a few minutes before you surrender to that knee-jerk response, like searching out food. Because when we press pause for a minute and take a time out, and then instead of trying to suppress your emotion, let it be front and center for now. Just, let it come out, and remember that this is going to pass. This too shall pass. This
Right.
emotion will
Right.
subside. And remind yourself too that emotional cravings cannot be filled with food. And a lot of times that only makes us feel worse, when we satisfy those emotions with food.
Right. And I like the way you said remind yourself. So I wrote down, just being mindful about what we do and teaching mindfulness. I know that's one of the things that the facilitators of the CHIP program really try to do, to help people be mindful about what they're doing, what they're eating. You really talked about having an alternative coping mechanism, and that requires having a plan. You actually have to plan something and be
Mm-hmm.
mindful about what you're doing, so you know how to respond appropriately to the stresses that come about.
Right.
Yeah, great points.
Okay. Well, the 11th barrier is physical food addiction, right?
Mm,
This is a big one. And this results when we've lost control over the ability to stop eating certain foods, especially the highly palatable foods, which trigger the release of dopamine in our brain's pleasure center, right?
mhm.
Sugar, cheese, chocolate, meats, salts, and fats all fall into that category. So if you obsess about certain foods or you crave them to the point where you'll go out of your way to get them,
Mhm.
or if you experience withdrawal or negative emotions when you don't have those foods, then you may have a food addiction going on.
Mhm.
So the best way to deal with food addictions is to sanitize your environment and remove the addictive foods, right? Dr. Barnard talks a lot about this too.
Right.
Total abstinence is important, because just trying to eat one Oreo or one piece of string cheese or one spoon of ice cream is going to keep that addiction alive and until it rears its ugly head and takes over again. Right? I've
Mhm.
tried it. I
Yeah.
know, I know it's hard to do that unless you go total cold turkey from it.
Yeah, and I think that it's important to really point out the fact that for people that really do have a true food addiction,
Hmm.
that really being as close to abstaining as much as you can is really important. Um, But on the flip side, I think a lot of people really are not truly addicted to food, so they can probably get away with not necessarily doing things in moderation, but realizing that if they fall off the wagon per se, just to try to get back on the wagon as quickly as you can. I like to tell my patients that none of us are perfect in what we do to stay healthy. So not to beat yourself up if you have a day when you have a few meals that are not really the healthiest, but just to try and get back on that healthier road, if you will, pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. And there are so many delicious substitutions for unhealthy foods too. And I think people don't realize that everything they're eating could be made healthier.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say that because one of the ladies that was in my CHIP program just put something up on the screen here. I think she says that I think that cooking and taste is one of the biggest misconceptions. I have learned how to convert some of my favorite non-vegan meals into vegan meals without losing the taste. So you're absolutely right. I mean, we can certainly. Did you ever see that program, Rehab Your Recipes?
There
was a television program. I don't know if it's on anymore. It was called Rehab Your Recipe, and these two plant-based chefs would take people's traditional recipes, say like mac and cheese or whatever, and they would rehab it into something that was so much healthier and just as palatable. So I think we really need to go through the teaching and the learning to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, another thing about food addiction too is this goes back to your mindset too, knowing your trigger points and planning ahead, right? So if you're going to a family gathering and there's going to be all these foods there that you might be addicted to, bring a healthy casserole or a crock pot of soup or a healthy plant-based dessert so that you have food there. If the office brings in glazed donuts on Wednesdays, bring a healthy alternative or avoid the break room altogether, right? And then set a deadline by which all these junk foods are going to be out of the house and the healthy alternatives will be in place.
Right.
And this is where all that planning pays off. So we can crowd out those addictive foods with the healthy ones.
Yeah. And really the encouragement, as you say, is really important. When you live in a house with other people, it really is important to try and get everybody on the same page if you can. But if not, what I tell my patients is just do it on your own. If your husband or your wife or your family don't want to be on board, you still have to take care of yourself so that you can be healthy and help other people. I think you have probably one more barrier, right?
Yeah, one more barrier. The 12th barrier is spiritual attack. And so for those of you who are not of the Christian faith, please just bear with me here for just a moment. But for those of you who do happen to be of the Christian faith, you know that scripture reminds us that we have an enemy who prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour, right? And that's typically Christians. And he attempts to prey upon our weak areas regarding our food choices and our health and our ability to change. He tries to keep us self-focused on our problems, and he tries to discourage our efforts to change. He strives to plant limiting beliefs in our head to make us feel defeated, and he attempts to weaken our resolve when it comes to food temptation. But notice that I said that he strives and he tries and he attempts, but he has no power or control over believers except for what we allow him to have.
Right. And, even if you're not spiritual or you don't have that, a belief towards a higher power, if you will, the powers that be on earth are just as problematic. When you think of the attack that we are constantly under when you turn the television on with all of these ads for junk food, junk food, fast foods, this is what we're constantly bombarded with.
Right.
So we really have to understand that those foods are really the enemy, and these companies really do prey upon people to become customers of theirs. And we all really have to realize that those types of food products, I have a hard time even calling them food, will really lead us down the road towards lots of disease.
We were talking about the spiritual attack, and I didn't get to the things you could do. And that's that mindfulness too, right? To recognize the enemy's tactics there and avoid going into agreement with the lies he tries to plant in our heads. That's a big one. And then win the battle between your ears by seeing if any strongholds have developed in your thinking, right, around these negative patterns that we can beat ourselves up about. And then remember that God always promises an escape route. Scripture tells us whenever you're tempted, there's an escape route for you. So you just have to figure out if you should flee the area or face the temptation. Like if you're in the candy aisle and you're being tempted by some candy, of course, it's best to flee the area before you begin to bargain with yourself about why it's going to be okay to buy candy. But if it's an emotional issue drawing you to the oily potato chips in the pantry, then of course you want to face that temptation and deal with it, as we've talked about. So those are the 12 barriers, but there's one more thing that I like to bring up, and that's the barrier combo pack, because this is what most of us are. Human behavior is really complex. So many of these barriers overlap or intertwine in some way. We just talked about denial and willful ignorance, combining. So if someone is seeking comfort foods, for example, that could be emotional eating, it could be food addiction, habit, or denial. It could be any of those. If someone has a negative view of healthy foods, that could be false perception or denial or pride. And if someone is complacent about making changes, that could be apathy or fear of change or avoidance of pain. That's why reading all the helpful tips is really important, because many of these things overlap. And then lastly, and you touched on this really well, Dr. Sal, is about mindfulness. And that is the key words that are reflect in all of these solutions are words like learn, determine, examine, recognize, know, choose, and decide. And all of those words indicate that our minds have to be fully engaged, right? If we're going to overcome the mental and physical battles that can keep us stuck from making changes. So as I talked about at the start too, this just scratches the surface of barriers that are out there. But if you recognize yourself stuck because of maybe one of these, then you may want to explore that further, dive deeper. And remember, everything you need to succeed with a healthy diet is already inside you. So develop your game plan and let's kick those barriers to the curb.
Right. Yeah, I always tell my patients, most people know what they need to do to stay healthy. But why is it that many of us don't do what we need to do to stay healthy? So you really have to figure out what are your barriers, what are the challenges that you're dealing with. And I know that the presentation certainly just scratches the surface. So for people that are interested, and we have this up on the offers, to get your Plan A diet and to really, get more information about what you're talking about. And, it's really important to educate ourselves to be sure that we know how to live on a regular basis. We got a question here for you. Can you share some information about people that are underweight, especially females and individuals that don't have an appetite? So how do you help those individuals along?
Well, just increase the amount of plant foods, healthy starches and plant foods that are being consumed. I mean, well, what's the underlying reason of being underweight would be the first question. They mentioned they don't like to eat a lot. Is that? Yeah,
it says that don't have an appetite, females that don't have an appetite, and you really hit the nail on the head. I mean, always looking for the cause of the problem. I think we in healthcare oftentimes look to put a Band-Aid on the problem right away by writing a prescription for a medicine or giving some sort of advice without really getting to the root of the problem. So I think you're absolutely right on. And the only thing that I encourage my patients to do is to say, if you're losing weight on a plant-based diet, maybe you're not eating enough calories because the volume of the food sometimes makes you feel full right away. So I'll have some of my patients actually do a calorie count and a protein count just to make sure that they're eating enough. Yeah.
Now, in that case, Dr. Sal, would you recommend like smoothies with avocado, some higher fat products as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you're losing weight on a plant-based diet and there's no other reason for it, you don't have any infections or, God forbid, cancer or something else that would make you lose weight, then really just making sure that you're getting enough protein and some healthy fats in your diet. Dr. Deal is on. I always like to give a shout out to Dr. Deal. He says, Cyd, I'm so proud of your book and your holistic perspective. Keep going, Han.
Oh, yeah. Dr. Deal wrote the foreword for my book.
I see. Well, I have it right here.
me.
have it right here, and it's got the forward on it. So, Marcella Trevino. Marcella is actually someone that also lives down here and works at the college. She's asking, would cannabis be advisable to stimulate appetite? I don't know if you've had any experience in that realm.
I really can't say. I mean, of course, that's the theory, right? Is that cannabis increases appetite, but I really don't have any studies or anything I could turn to for that.
Yeah, and I don't prescribe it in my practice, but certainly anecdotally, I've heard that individuals unfortunately with cancer will oftentimes use some form of cannabis to stimulate their appetite. And in that situation, it's probably helpful because, you don't want people to be losing weight. That really affects their immune system and such. So you have to take, I think in this regard, I would say you really have to look at the individual and make sure that you're treating the individual and not a group of people, if you will.
Right.
We have another one here. When going out to a restaurant, call them ahead and see if they have I'll replace your word vegan with plant-based alternative, and request if they are willing to accommodate you with a special request. I don't know about you, Cyd, but I've been to so many different restaurants, and I would say 95% of the time they will accommodate.
They do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think that's really a big issue, but I like the idea of even calling ahead. And sometimes what I've also done is written out what I would like to eat, and when the waiter comes over, I just hand it to him and say, "See if the chef could make this for me." And a lot of times they will. Yeah. These are great barriers. I love the things that you talked about. Writing down and evaluating your fears. That was really great. Your habits, promoting good health habits. The issue of false perceptions and the part on rebellion, and then how to deal with social pressure and alternative coping mechanisms. That was great. I really like the way you summarized that. Someone asked about the social determinants of health. So how do you deal with the social determinants of health if an individual doesn't have a job, they're on an extremely limited budget, if they don't have access? A lot of people that if you don't have a car, you can't get to the grocery store, and you have to rely on the local bodegas or stores that might not sell the healthiest food. So how do you help people deal with those health issues that come about as a result of social determinants of health?
Well, I would think of those, I would take each challenge one by one, and separate those out. First of all, what would be the biggest one would be lack of income. Is that one of them that you mentioned?
Yes.
Well, we know that healthy eating can be very inexpensive, right? If we're buying beans and rice and corn and stuff. So there's ways to eat healthy and still not spend a lot of money. There's a lot of resources out there about that.
Yeah. I like the dollar stores. One of my patients said she shops at the dollar store because they have rice and beans. And rice and beans, when you think about it, is actually a great meal, high in protein. So if you can shop in that fashion, and even if you can find a farmer's market where things are locally grown and the prices are a little bit cheaper. So yeah, I agree with you. You have to take one at a time. So what should we leave the audience with as far as an action plan that they could start to do today?
Well, let's think about the barriers for a second. If you recognize yourself there somewhere, then take an action step toward that today and start to explore that a little further. But know that diet is our number one cause of disability and disease. I mean, it's not just something you should put off, right? Start now. Don't wait until 6 months from now.
Right.
There's an urgency to healthy eating, in my opinion, as our country grows heavier and sicker with each passing year.
Right.
So many preventable illnesses. And the body is always striving to heal, right? We've got that going for us. I mean, the body wants to fight for our health. So when we get the right environment to do that, it can.
Right. Absolutely. Well, that's so good. So we'll leave that with the audience as their action plan. So your action plan is to start now. The simple things that you can do to stay healthy can start with the next meal or the next piece of food that you put in your mouth. So make sure that you're just very mindful about that. And then really, as Cyd, as you just said, identifying your barriers and just writing down what the barriers are and trying to develop a plan, an action plan to get around those barriers, under, over, around, whatever, however you want to manage it. So Cyd, I want to thank you again. It's been great to talk with you today. Thank you for being on the show. I'll leave you with the last word. I think you wanted to say something about your program, Inflammation in Your Diet.
Yeah, so if you're interested in the book, that's on my website, cydnotter.com is where you can find my book if you're interested.
Okay.
And then I have a free offer for CHIP people today. If you're interested, I have a class that I teach at our local college in Illinois. It's called Inflammation in Your Diet. And I will give that to you for free through the month of January. If you're interested in that, just type the word CHIP at the checkout. And you can access that course from my website. There's a courses tab.
Very cool.
Find it.
Well, thank you for that offer. That's nice. So today's the 20th of January. You have until the 31st. So get that done. Well, Cyd, it's been great to see you. Thank you so much for being on the program. Thank you for being such a champion for healthy living and for helping us get around our barriers. And I will wish you a blessed and a healthy 2021.
Thank you, Dr. Sal. It's been my honor to be here today.